This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. We are at the end of the first partial week anyway of Edge of Eternities Limited, and I now have enough drafts under my belt to give you some broad advice about the format. You know, we don't have enough data right now to really dive in on like super individual cards and whether I was wrong or right about them. That's what we'll look at next week though. But I do feel comfortable giving you some advice about some specific things that are going on in this format that you should keep in mind if you want to make sure you do well in it. So first, let's start talking about spacecraft. This was probably one of the biggest things going into the set where people had really differing opinions. A lot of people thought that they just wouldn't be good because you don't have time to station them. In my set review, especially if they had Inter's triggers, I thought they had a chance to be quite good, especially when those Inter's triggers augmented your board in some way, because then that meant it was easier to station them. And I'd say overall, spacecraft are good, especially the ones that do something immediately, give you a card of value. They don't even necessarily have to add to the board. There are a lot of points in the game where if you draw that, you can still just immediately station it. They're really interesting, flexible cards like that, where you can play them early for whatever value they give you. And in that case, you may not station them for a while, but there are plenty of turns where they just get stationed immediately. And I'm sure we've all seen that at this point. I would say, though, you don't want too many spacecraft. It was sort of like that with vehicles in the past, right? You need creatures to get your spacecraft going, and if you have too many spacecraft, you're not going to have enough creatures. So, you know, I think most decks probably have 2 to 3 stations or spacecraft, and occasionally you can support more depending on what you have going on in your deck. But don't go too hard on them, especially the ones that don't add to the board, because they do become a liability when you're playing a bunch of them, and you're also not good at stationing them. Overall, I'd say spacecraft are good, and that's really cool because they are a new thing. Even though they're kind of like a spin on vehicles, they're different enough because of the whole station thing that I think they're pretty interesting, and I think they did a good job costing them and making their station what they are. Let's move now to another prominent mechanic in the set, landers. Overall, they make fixing a lot easier, and I think that's pretty sweet. If you're in a deck, especially like a green one, and you get like 3 of the Wayfarer, which I don't know how much longer that's going to happen, but so far I've seen them really late in drafts all the time, which shocks me, because I think it's better than most uncommons and even rares in the format. The 3-mana 3/3 that makes a lander, just because it generates a nice 2-for-1. You can do all kinds of value things with landers, so they're very good. And it's nice not having to spend as many picks on lands, like when you're trying to splash a third color. Like, I had a deck that had 7 wins that just had a bunch of different ways to make landers, and I splashed red because I was low on removal outside of it. And I just ran 1 mountain and easily got my red mana all the time because I had 3 Wayfarers and the 1 mana sorcery that makes a lander. Like, when your regular cards that already do a bunch of stuff in the set also are sources of fixing, that ends up being pretty sweet, and you do generally end up with a more powerful deck because those are cards you're going to play anyway, and they end up fixing your mana in a big way. Like, in most sets, a mana base like that one, and I actually think I have a screenshot of this, so hopefully it's on the screen. In most sets, running that mana base with no duels or anything would be terrible. Like, if I'm splashing 3 red cards like I was in this deck. But this isn't most formats, and that's kind of my point. You can get away with this kind of deck thanks to all the landers, as long as you're careful. Like, you know, green was mostly the color where I had landers, and I needed to make sure I had enough green to play the things that gave me landers, which would fix my mana. But I think that's one really sweet thing they allow for. And just like spacecraft right now, I feel like I was maybe even a little low on landers just because there are even more things you can do with them than I expected. There are a lot of ways to sack them for value or get value out of just controlling an artifact that they're quite good too. Overall, you know, I don't have a point I want to address here about warp, mostly because I think everybody knows that's good and knew it was good going into the set review. It looks like powerful mechanics we've seen before. That's true of landers too, to be fair. Like every artifact token has been good, but warp was even more obviously good because it looked a lot like adventure, for example, or suspend to a certain extent, or the Thunder Junction mechanic that let you pay a certain amount for a card and then you could cast it free later. Like it looks like all these mechanics that all fared pretty well in limited, and it has. I mean, the cards with it are really good. Most of them, you would be more right than wrong if you just assumed every card with warp in this set was good, and that's not quite true. But there are a lot of really good ones, and so I'm not talking about that mechanic in this video. Besides saying, yeah, it is really good, because I don't think that advice is nearly as useful as with spacecraft and landers. I'm talking about different things you can do or should do with deck building as a result of what the format looks like, and that's not what I'm doing with warp. I'm just saying it's good. And on a related note to landers, the real big expensive creatures at Uncommon are better than I expected. That's one area where I feel reasonably confident saying I was wrong already, because both Glacier Godmaw and Mouth of the Storm are both really good. Most sets, 6 mana is kind of the stopping point for your typical limited deck. Like you can't really consistently look at, especially lower rarity 7 drops that don't just win the game, and think I could play this and it'll be really good. Like I didn't think either of these cards were bad. I gave the Godmaw a C+ in the set review and the Mouth a C. But it's even easier to get to them than I thought. And there were people, I'll note, that told me, especially after the pre-release, that Glacier Godmaw was amazing. And I think they were right, because I've played with and against it enough now, especially the Godmaw, to feel that way. My concern about it going into the set was that it would be really hard to hit your land drop that you also needed to trigger this when it came down, because you really need to do that with this for it to really feel powerful, because then it can enter the fray. It feels sort of like Craterhoof Behemoth, but it's easier to do thanks to landers, which again overlap into all these different things: landfall, artifacts, sacrifice, and so it ends up being pretty easy to trigger it once the turn you play it. Like the end of your opponent's turn, you crack a lander, get a land, and then you play it land on your turn. Well, you play the Godmaw, then play a land, and the game's pretty much over. Like that ends up actually working out a reasonable chunk of the time. And so both the Godmaw and Mouth of the Storm, to a lesser extent, have been pretty good. The Mouth gives you a huge flyer that can end the game in a few turns and also nerfs your opponent's stuff for a whole turn cycle. It's not quite as immediate of a wow, I just lost the game effect as the Godmaw can be, but it kind of has the same effect, just a little more slowly. So let's talk broadly now about the colors. Overall, it seems like green is really good, and the 2 decks I've liked the most are blue-green and green-white, and that's partly because green's commons are so good, partly because of that 3-mana 3/3 that makes a lander, which is probably the best common in the set. But green has other great commons too. Even if it did get nerfed by an erratum, Diplomatic Relations is still a really good card. Germinating Worm has been pretty good overall. I was a little low on that one in the set review because it just seemed weaker than most of the big creature that gains you life that green decks often need to stabilize. But because it's cheaper, it kind of makes up for that, and you can even warp it earlier, which gives you some serious value. One green card in particular that has surprised me early and been way more useful than I expected is Gene Pollinator. Didn't hate it in the set review, but I did think it would be way too hard to consistently produce mana of any color with it. Once you're tapping your lands alongside it, it's not really doing anything. But it turns out that it's actually a pretty good way to fix your mana. It's another thing that can make your mana really great in this format without needing any fixing lands. And this is another area where landers are really useful. Warp creatures are really useful. There are just so many different ways. They designed a lot of cards like this in this set, that this card ends up having something to tap that doesn't really hurt you all that often. And sometimes it's worth tapping something to get that extra mana or fix your mana. And then later in the game, you can just sacrifice Gene Pollinator for value once you don't need the mana anymore. And there are lots of ways to do that, like the 4-mana 3/4 artifact creature that sacks an artifact, puts a counter somewhere, and draws you a card. That feels pretty great later in the game. So yeah, I mean, green is pretty deep at common. It does have one that stands like head and shoulders above the rest, and it doesn't have any others that I think are like incredible other than the Wayfarer. But the Wayfarer is so good, and then there's this super deep roster of like C plus level commons that ends up making it a really good color in the format overall. It's also really good because you have probably the most access to landers in most green decks, and you can just end up playing powerful cards and splashing them, which is a relatively easy thing to do in the format. Red, meanwhile, has not impressed me that much. I thought it was going to be a pretty deep color for commons overall. I especially liked Kov Landseeker and Zookeeper Mechan, and they're both pretty good. But both of them are not as good as the cards that I just mentioned in green overall. The one card in red that is worth mentioning that is better because of landers too, by the way, is Nebula Dragon. I don't think it's good as the other two, but I thought it was going to be terrible. But it's another big, expensive creature that landers make far more viable. Comes down lightning bolt something, and that's pretty sweet. So, red isn't a color I love right now, and it mostly comes down to being super shallow at common when it comes to, really good commons. It doesn't really have one right now that I would say stands out the way Night Luminary does and white. These other colors all have one common that's just amazing, and red kind of doesn't, and that's kind of a problem overall. It's not unplayable. It's way too early in the format to be like, the format is solved, just don't play red. I rarely say that anyway, but there are occasionally formats where you kind of need to avoid a color. And right now, I mean, I don't think it's that bad. It's just not, the payoffs for being in red just aren't that amazing. So overall, as a splash color where you play a little bit of removal or whatever, that's one thing. But beyond that, it hasn't been that impressive of a color. I don't think in general the your creatures are tapped, get some value mechanic has panned out in a big way. I was a little skeptical about it in the set review because, I didn't like especially the red-white signpost that much because it was understated and asked for something significant. I mean, you can trigger these things, you can for sure, but the number of situations where you're in a spot where it's like the fail case are just massive, and you end up with really understated creatures in most of those cases. So, if I was going to say there's one deck that I don't advise drafting unless it's really open, it would be red-white. Part of the problem, too, is, that deck's supposed to be really into spacecraft, but, you can't run that many, like I said at the beginning of this video. So, it ends up not going super well. I've had red-white decks do fine. You can do it. The color pair needs to be open, though. And most of the time, you're not really leaning into that tap synergy because it feels like almost all of those cards have underperformed, which even more so than I thought they would, I think, overall. Meanwhile, I'd say broadly the lander decks, that's blue-green and red-green, and the artifact decks like blue-black have been pretty good overall. All right, so that is sort of an early overview about how I feel about this format. Basically, most of the things are a little better than I expected them to be, except for red-white, which I think is worse than I expected, even though I didn't have high hopes for it. And I think that the landers are even a little better than I thought they'd be. Spacecraft, even a little better than I thought they would be. So overall, I think it's a pretty sweet format. There's lots of cool little things you can do with, various artifact value things you have going on or land value things. It feels like a reasonably grindy set thanks to the landers and everything too. So I'm having fun with the new format overall, even though Final Fantasy, I think, was a really good one. I think this one is basically on the same level right now. We'll see if it still feels the same 50 drafts in like Final Fantasy did. So, all right, that'll do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Next week, I'll be back to talk about what I got wrong in really specific terms about cards, because we'll have enough data at that point for me to, really know where I was wrong in my set review about individual cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to see more content about this format, including draft videos, my set review, other episodes of Need to Notes, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.